Now let me add the provider package in our pubspec.yaml file. So go to the pubspec.yaml file and just under the internationalization package, I'm writing provider and press pubget. You can also go to the pub.dev site to get all the packages, and you can also read the documentations about each of these libraries if you want to learn about those libraries. So this is the provider package and the publisher is Dash Overflow, and the popularity is 100%, points 140 out of 140, and it has many, and it is liked by many developers all around the world. And if you click this provider link here, you can also copy this link here and paste it to the pubspec.yaml if you want the version number also. And also you can read the readme section here if you want to know more about the provider, or what provider is and how it works, what can you do with it, what methods and classes you can use with these libraries. Everything is here. So before I implement the structure, or before I use the provider package, I want to show you a diagram first. So this is the structure I want to achieve with my Flutter project. So we should have a UI component that will be comprised with all our UI classes or widget classes. We should have another class that will be a provider class. We should have a class, a data source class, and we already have this data source class, an abstract class which actually consists of a bunch of abstract methods. And we should have data source class. If we have multiple data sources, then we should have multiple data source class. So how many data source class we need, it actually depends from where we want to get our data. So if you want to get your data from the local database, then you should create a class, and that class should extend this data source class so that this child class can override all the methods and we can call this method to actually get the data from the local database like SQLite. If you have another data source like Firebase, then you should create another class, and this class should also extend this data source class and override all the methods, and then implement the method with the Firebase codes. And if you have another data source like we will have in our project, a Spring Boot remote server, and then you should create another class, and that class will also extend this data source class, override all the methods, and inside those overridden methods we will have the web request specific codes. So in this structure, the main benefit we get is, if you want to change any of the data source, like at first you start your project with a local database and you finish the project, and at some point you want to change your data source from local to cloud, and if you had written all your database related codes inside the UI classes, and to change all the database related codes, you would need to access all the pages and change all the codes sequentially. But if we have a structure like this, then all we need to do is to change the data source only. We don't have to go inside the UI pages and change the codes. We don't need to go inside the provider class or the data source class. These sections or these components will be intact and unchanged, and in this way we can actually extend our project whenever we need a new feature, and we can add those features without breaking our codes. So now that we have a page, a search page, in a moment or maybe in the next video we will create a new page, a search result page. Now in this video I will create a new class, a provider class, which responsibility will be to connect the UI pages or UI components to the data source, this provider class will act as a bridge between this UI pages and data source, so that UI pages will not ever know where its data coming from or where its data going, and as well as data source section will never know where its data coming from and where its data are going. So this provider is actually an abstraction layer between the data source and the UI pages. So let's get back to the code. So inside the data source class, I need to create another data source. For our dummy data source, the file name should be dummy data source. And of course, we will replace this dummy data source class with another class when we actually finish with our Spring Boot project. So I'm creating this Dart file, and this will be a class dummy data source that will extend our abstract data source class. And since our data source class have many abstract methods, this class should override all the methods. So I'm pressing Alt Enter, create 14 missing overrides, and these are the methods that are overridden from the data source class. So by the default implementation, each of every method is actually throwing an exception, but we will return specific data type when needed actually. And now we should create another class, the provider class. And to create the provider class, I will use the providers directory, and inside these provider directories I will create another Dart file, and that should be an app data provider. So this will be a class named app data provider, and it will extend the change notifier. So what is the role of change notifier? Actually, I need to import material.dart. So this is a class that will provide data from data source to the UIs, and also this class have an extra responsibility, and this class will act as a notifier. So this class will notify all our UIs if any data set are changed. So first of all, in order to make this class useful, I need to register this provider class in the widget tree. So let's go back to the main.dart file, and since our root widget is my app, we need to change our root widget from my app to something else, and that will be a change notifier provider. This class is coming from the provider package, and we need to pass an argument create, that is a function that gives us a context, and from here we need to create our provider class object. So app data provider. As you can see, when our application launches, at the very first, at the top of widget tree, our app data provider class object is created, and we will use this object throughout our entire project. So whenever, in whatever widget class we stay, whenever we want a provider object, we just simply ask our Flutter to give us the provider object that is created at the very beginning of our application. So now that we have registered our app data provider class, we need to define some functions inside this class. So go to the app data provider class and define a function, and the function will return a bus route object. So future bus route, a nullable object bus route, and I will naming the method as get route by city from and city to, and we will pass the bus route name. To complete this method, let's take a reference of the data source class. So final data source, that will be dummy data source. As you can remember, our data source class is abstract, and by definition we cannot create an object of data source. So if you try to create an object of an abstract class, it will show an error, because with abstract class you cannot create any object. But what you can do is you can pass a child object to the parent type. So in this case we are actually doing the polymorphism. So this is a parent type and this is the child type, and when we actually need to remove these dummy data with the real one, we create a new class, new data source class, maybe the app data source class, and we will just replace that class with this one, so that we don't need to change anything inside app data provider, also inside the widget classes. And from here I'm simply returning the data source get routes by city from and city2 method and passing the city from and city2. Okay, the route name should not be here. We need to pass the city from and city2, because that's the things that we got from these two drop down buttons. So city from and string city2. And I need to import this function, this class. And inside the data source you will see we have where is my data source class? My data source class is here, and inside this data source class we have an abstract method get route by city from and city2, and this method is overridden inside the dummy data source class. So let's scroll down a bit, and now this method get route by city from and city2. Now this is the method where we actually expose our data source, that means our TempDB. So the code we have written here should be removed from here to actually there. So I have made the return type nullable because this function either gives us a route object or throws an exception. So in case of exception, we don't want to handle the exception from the data source class. Instead, if this function throws an exception, state error exception, we will simply return null, so that I have made this return type as nullable. Now I am going to cut this code from here and paste it to directly here. So TempDB, we need to import this, and the variable name should be changed from city from to city2, and the return type should be not like this. Let's just define a bus route object first. So bus route, and then we also need to do this here actually. I need to, okay, let's just put back everything and let's just cut the whole try catch thing. So cut from here and paste it just here, and just replace the parameters, and we don't want to show any snack bars from the data source class, because this is UI related code. We don't want to show any snack bar from data source. We only want to show or write this kind of code inside the UI classes only. So now we have a nullable route object, and we are trying to get the route object from this table route. And if we get the route object from here, we will simply return this route object. And if anything goes wrong, like this method shows or throws an exception, then we will return null. and this method is marked as future. You can probably ask why this method marked as future, because we are not making any network requests. But remember, we are not currently making any network request, but in future, when you are done with Spring Boot, that our data will be coming from the remote server. And so that I have made this method future, so that we don't have to change whenever we change the data source and so on. And whenever a method is marked future, you cannot just return anything like this. You need to specify this method as async to tell Flutter that this method is an asynchronous function. And that's it. We are all set and done. So this method will return either a bus route object or a null value. And now we will call this function from app data provider, and we are doing this right now here. And now what should we do inside this search page? We'll simply call the provider function. We will call this provider function and pass the inputs to the provider class, and provider class will delegate this input to another component like data source, and the data source is responsible for fetching the data. So data source is the component where we actually exposing our data source or database. And now the last thing, we need to call this method, and since this method is inside this class, we need an object of this class. And like I said before, the object of this class is already created at the very first of launching this application. We need to get this object by a convention, and the convention is we have actually few options to do that, to get the app data provider object. And one of the way is you just need to call this provider dot of, and this provider class is coming from the provider package, and the provider dot of context, and you have to pass another argument that is listen false. And why listen false, I will explain in a moment. And I need to specify from which provider or which provider class object we want, and I need to specify the provider class here. And this entire thing actually will return a provider object. And to prove that, just I am typing a dot, and then you can see we can actually call the function, the provider function from here. We need to pass the city from and city to. So city from or from city, this is very frustrating and confusing. Okay, and I need to pass the not null assertion, and this will be to city. So this function will return a bus route object, and since it is marked as future, this method will not immediately return the object. And to get the actual object, actual return type, we can mark this method async, and we can use the await keyword here. But like I said before, we have another option to get the future value, and that is to call a then function. So after every future method, you have a function you can call that is then. So then is a function that is only called when this function is done or successfully returns something, or this function has done its job successfully without any error. So then function is called, the value is returned. So this is the route object actually. And now what we want to do is we want to go from this page to another page, and we also want this route object to that another page. That means we need to pass this route object as well as the departure date string version to the next page. So now we need to create a search result page that we will create in the next lecture. But before I finish this video, I want to explain why this listen false is used. If we don't pass this argument by default, if I hover over this op function here, the listen default value is true. So I mentioned about some responsibilities of a provider class, and that is provider class not only just provides us the data from the data source, it has another responsibility to notify our UIs. So in the provider class, we have actually extends, our provider class actually extends a change notifier object. So whenever any data source changes, our app data provider class has the ability to notify our widgets so that our widgets can rebuild without the help of set state. That means we can actually rebuild our widget with the help of this provider object. We don't need stateful widget, we don't need set state method. Although we actually combine stateful widget, set state, and provider, there is no clear-cut rule actually, which is stated in the Flutter documentation also. But now our provider class has also the ability to notify UIs. And here, if we want our provider object not to notify our UIs, then we should specify listen false. That means we are telling Flutter that I need a provider object, but I don't need that provider object to update any UIs, any widgets inside this search page widget. So to do that, we need to pass this listen false argument, otherwise exception will be thrown. And if we want this provider object to update any widgets, then we should not pass this argument and let it be default as true. So now in the next video, next lecture, I will be creating a search result page, and I will carry this route object and departure date along with us. And also I will introduce you a named routing navigation process, or the named routing API that will be used for navigating or navigation from one widget to another. See you in the next lecture.